Lucas stood alone, the air around him growing colder with each step he took toward the old well. The farm was hidden deep in the countryside, far from the nearest town, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to swallow the moonlight, leaving the area in near-complete darkness. A fog was settling over the ground, clinging to his legs like icy fingers, and each gust of wind seemed to carry whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that played at the edge of his hearing. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the uneven ground. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe, as if the earth itself was alive, guarding the secrets it buried long ago. As he approached the well, Lucas felt an inexplicable heaviness settling over him, a pressure that grew more intense with every step closer. He could sense that the air here was different. It was thick, almost palpable, carrying a weight of despair and dread that seemed to press down on his shoulders. The old stones of the well were covered in dark moss, and the wooden frame above it was cracked and splintered, as if something had clawed at it, trying to escape. Lucas swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his heartbeat echoing louder in his ears than the faint rustle of leaves around him. The silence was overwhelming. Not a single sound of night creatures disturbed the air. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was as if even the animals avoided this place, as though they sensed the malevolence that clung to it. He reached out, hesitating, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold stone. Just as he touched it, he felt an icy chill shoot up his arm, making his skin prickle with goosebumps. He jerked his hand back, but it was too late. A faint sound began to rise from within the well, a distant, guttural moan that seemed to echo up from unfathomable depths. The sound was faint at first, almost too quiet to be real, but as he strained to listen, it grew louder, like the anguished cry of something trapped in the dark. Lucas's breathing quickened as he realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, a symphony of tormented souls crying out in a despair that shook him to his core. Each moan was layered with pain, fear, and desperation, creating a chilling chorus that reverberated within him. The voices seemed to call to him, begging, pleading, as if they could sense his presence and wanted him to come closer. He fought the urge to look down into the well, feeling an instinctual fear gripping him, warning him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something compelled him, a morbid curiosity mixed with a strange pull, as though the well itself was drawing him in. He took a shaky step forward, peering into the darkness below. His flashlight beam barely penetrated the blackness within, illuminating only a few feet of the stone walls before it was swallowed by the void. Yet as he stared, he thought he saw movement, shadows shifting, twisting just out of reach, like hands grasping from below, yearning to touch the light. A sudden gust of wind swept past him, chilling him to the bone and making the trees around the clearing groan, as if in warning. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Lucas felt his heart pounding, each beat echoing the rising panic inside him. He stumbled back, almost tripping over a rock, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the well. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on him, and the faint smell of damp earth and decay filled his nostrils, turning his stomach. In that moment, he understood that he was not alone. Something was watching him, waiting, and it had been there, lurking in the shadows of that cursed well, for a very, very long time. As Lucas tried to shake off the fear that clung to him, he noticed something peculiar half buried in the dirt beside the well. The faint outline of a small, weathered object caught the dim glow of his flashlight. Curious and unsettled, he crouched down and brushed the loose earth away, uncovering a doll, its porcelain face cracked and smeared with dirt. A jolt of recognition coursed through him as he stared at it. It was almost identical to a doll his younger sister used to carry everywhere. The very same one that had vanished from her room the day she went missing. His hands trembled as he picked it up, memories flooding back, memories he had buried deep. He remembered the doll's empty eyes staring up at him from his sister's small hands, her laughter echoing in their family home. But this doll was wrong. Its eyes seemed darker, more vacant, and the smile painted on its face was faded, almost twisted, as if mocking him. His heart began to race, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. How had this doll, or one so hauntingly similar, ended up here, in the middle of nowhere? Lucas's mind struggled to make sense of it, but the fog of confusion was laced with an unease that gnawed at him. He could almost hear his sister's voice, faint and distant, whispering his name as if from a dream. It was impossible. She had been missing for years, and he had given up hope of ever finding answers. But here, in this place that reeked of death and decay, the past he'd tried to bury clawed its way back to the surface, raw and painful. The doll felt heavy in his hand, as though it were alive, pulsing with a darkness that seeped into his skin. A sudden, unbearable ache flared in his right shoulder, and he gasped, clutching at it. When he pulled back his sleeve, he saw a faint scar he'd long forgotten, a small, jagged mark he had gotten as a child when he and his sister had fallen while playing in the woods. But this time, the scar felt fresh, almost like it had been reopened. He touched it gingerly, and a sense of foreboding washed over him, as if the pain itself was trying to warn him. The doll in his hand seemed to grow colder, and the well behind him whispered with renewed fervor, its voices hissing accusations he couldn't understand. Lost in the swirling terror of his own thoughts, Lucas looked back at the well. The connection was undeniable now. This place had somehow been waiting for him, its shadows steeped in the memories he had fought to forget. The more he stared at the doll, the more the old, buried memories surfaced, piecing together an image he didn't want to see. He remembered the last day he'd seen his sister, the way she had begged him to go exploring near the old barn on their family's property, a barn he had refused to enter because it felt wrong. She had laughed, calling him a coward, and he had walked away, leaving her behind. He never saw her again. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Was it possible? Had she somehow ended up here? In this well, this cursed hole in the earth that seemed to breathe with malevolent energy. The doll, the scar, the memories, they were more than coincidences. They were signs, threads pulling him deeper into the dark web of a forgotten tragedy. Lucas felt his grip on reality slipping, the lines between past and present blurring as the whispers from the well grew louder, almost desperate. They weren't random noises anymore. They sounded like a voice, a child's voice, echoing up from the depths, crying for help. His sister's voice. As the truth settled over him, he realized with dawning horror that this place was connected to her disappearance. The well, the doll, his scar. They were all pieces of a twisted puzzle, fragments of a story that had been hidden from him all these years. He wanted to run, to flee the madness that threatened to consume him, but something rooted him to the spot, compelling him to face the dark, forgotten past he had tried to leave behind. The well seemed to beckon him, its whispers curling around him like icy tendrils, pulling him toward the edge. And then, barely audible, he heard it, a faint, trembling voice that chilled him to his core. "Lucas, is that you?" Lucas's mind raced, his breath catching as he processed the voice that echoed from the depths. It was unmistakable, his sister's voice, calling to him, fragile and desperate, as if trapped in a nightmare. His instinct was to turn and run, to abandon this haunted place and everything it had unearthed from his past. But something stronger held him in place, a pull he couldn't ignore, a bond that transcended the fear clawing at his mind. He felt that if he left now, he would lose his sister forever, condemning her to whatever nightmare lingered in the darkness below. Yet, the rational part of him screamed warnings. The well was old, crumbling, and who knew what lay at the bottom? Descending into its depths could mean certain death. The thought of slipping into that cold, unyielding darkness, descending into an abyss where even light feared to venture, sent a surge of terror through him. But what if she was truly down there? What if he was her only chance, her last hope? The agony of not knowing was unbearable, and a choice began to take shape in his mind, a choice no one should have to make. His fingers brushed over the doll, now feeling like an anchor, a relic of something both precious and cursed. It seemed to pulsate in his hand, as if urging him to act, a silent witness to the pain that bound him to this place. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. To descend into the well was to embrace the darkness, to accept the unknown horrors that lurked below. But to leave was to abandon any hope of redemption, to forever carry the guilt that he had left her behind again. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, pleading, "Don't leave me." But then a terrifying thought clawed its way into his mind. What if the voice he heard wasn't her at all? What if it was something far darker, a malevolent force using her voice, preying on his grief and guilt to lure him down? The well seemed alive, breathing with a sinister intelligence, its whispers shifting and changing, as if feeding on his hesitation. It was a trap, he was certain of it, but it was a trap that held the one thing he couldn't resist, the faint possibility that his sister was still alive. As the air grew colder and the silence around him deepened, Lucas felt himself slipping into a dark reverie. A twisted image crept into his mind, the well consuming him, swallowing him whole, his screams joining the chorus of lost voices echoing from its depths. The thought was horrifying, but he couldn't shake it. There was only one way to find out the truth, but the cost was steep: his own sanity, perhaps even his life. He could sense the well waiting, patient and eternal, like a hungry beast that knew he would eventually come to it. Another option surfaced, one that chilled him even more. If the well demanded a price, perhaps he could give it something in return, something of himself. He could surrender a part of his mind, a piece of his own memories, in exchange for a glimpse of the truth. The thought made his skin crawl, but the temptation lingered, like a dark whisper at the edge of his consciousness. The well could take away the pain, the guilt, even the memories of his sister, leaving him free from the torment he'd carried for years. But he would be sacrificing his own humanity, losing the pieces of himself that defined who he was. The impossible choice loomed before him, each option more horrifying than the last. Descend into the well and risk becoming another lost soul in its endless depths, or turn his back, live with the doubt, and surrender a part of himself to the darkness. He knew that no matter what he chose, he would leave a part of himself behind in this cursed place. With a final, shuddering breath, he looked down into the well, the darkness seeming to reach up for him, like twisted fingers of shadow, eager to pull him in. In that moment, he made his decision. The world around him faded, and all that remained was the haunting whisper of his sister's voice, calling to him, begging him to join her, to venture into the unknown and face whatever horrors lay hidden in the depths. The well pulsed with dark energy, and Lucas, trembling with fear, yet driven by a love that surpassed reason, took his first step toward the edge, surrendering to the pull of the unknown. As Lucas took his first, hesitant step toward the edge of the well, the world around him seemed to shift, as if reality itself were bending to accommodate the darkness that pulsed within the depths. The fog thickened, coiling around him like smoke, and the once familiar sounds of the night faded into a heavy silence. His breathing was the only noise, ragged and shallow, yet even that seemed muffled, swallowed by an unseen force. The trees that bordered the clearing seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal hands reaching to block his escape. Then, just as he leaned forward to peer into the abyss, a faint whisper brushed against his ear. It was so close, as if someone stood just behind him, breathing icy words into the darkness. Lucas. The voice was barely audible, a fragile sound that shivered through the night air. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned sharply, expecting to find someone, or something, standing there. But the clearing was empty, save for the faint, swirling mist that drifted over the ground. Yet the voice continued, growing softer, more insistent, slipping beneath his skin like a fevered chill. "Come closer," the whisper seemed to say, weaving through his mind, dissolving his will to resist. Every time he tried to pull himself back from the edge, the voice grew louder, tugging at the corners of his mind, like a thread unraveling his sense of self. It was relentless, a murmuring seduction that drew him nearer, and he found himself compelled, not by curiosity, but by a primal need to obey. Each word that floated up from the well seemed to bring memories with it. Memories he'd long buried, memories of laughter and loss, of days spent in his sister's company, her voice echoing in his mind, intertwining with the whispers. As the whispers continued, the air around him thickened, pressing in like invisible hands. Shadows began to ripple along the ground, creeping closer, moving in unnatural patterns that defied logic, as though they were alive, feeding off his fear. Lucas's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams that twisted the shadows into grotesque forms. Faces appeared and disappeared within them, eyes hollow, mouths frozen in silent screams. Each shadow seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it held the echoes of the souls lost to the well. He could feel their suffering, their agony, bleeding into his mind, clouding his thoughts with terror. Then, the ground beneath him began to tremble, almost imperceptibly at first, like a heartbeat buried deep within the earth. It grew stronger, more pronounced, and with each tremor, he heard the whispers grow more urgent, filling his mind with fragmented words, half-formed pleas, and the faint sound of crying. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the madness, but the darkness seemed to seep into him, twisting his thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. He could feel the presence of something watching him from the shadows, studying him, waiting for him to break. A cold hand brushed against his shoulder. His eyes flew open, but there was no one there. His heart raced, his skin prickling with fear as he felt invisible fingers slide down his arm, wrapping around his wrist like an iron shackle. Panic flared in his chest, and he tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't obey. The shadows clung to him, whispering secrets, feeding him images of horrors he couldn't comprehend, of people swallowed by the well, their souls trapped in a limbo of eternal suffering. He could almost feel the darkness pulling him, promising that same fate if he dared to resist. For a brief moment, Lucas saw his own reflection in the depths of the well, distorted and twisted, as if it belonged to someone else, a version of himself lost to despair and fear, eyes hollow and haunted. The reflection seemed to move on its own, mimicking his movements with a slight delay, its gaze vacant and lost. As he watched, his reflection raised a hand, pressing a single finger to its lips in a chilling gesture of silence, as if warning him not to scream, not to resist. The sight sent a shiver through him, rooting him to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away. And then he heard it, another whisper, soft but unmistakably sinister, curling through the darkness like a serpent. "You belong here, Lucas. You've always belonged here." The words slithered into his mind, filling him with a dread so profound it felt like drowning. The well seemed to pulse in response, as if it were a living thing, breathing in his fear, feeding off his terror. He could feel it in his bones, the realization that whatever lay within the well wasn't just calling to him, it was consuming him, one heartbeat at a time, drawing him deeper into its grasp. The shadows crept closer, tightening their hold, and for the first time, Lucas felt truly helpless, a fragile soul on the brink of surrender. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, blending into a cacophony of despair, of voices pleading, screaming, laughing, a symphony of madness that drowned out his thoughts, leaving him numb and hollow. The well had become a living nightmare, and Lucas stood at the edge, teetering on the brink, his mind unraveling as the darkness beckoned him to join it, to surrender to the whispers in the shadows. As the whispers consumed him, Lucas felt his grip on reality slipping, his mind sinking into a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, moving with a life of their own, as though they were alive, watching him, waiting. Each shadow seemed to hold a new terror, flickering images of twisted faces and clawed hands reaching out from the darkness. His body trembled, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to force himself to look away, to break free from the pull of the well. But he couldn't. Something deep within him was drawn to it, as if the darkness spoke to his own hidden fears, his unspoken nightmares. His mind began to betray him, conjuring horrific visions that felt all too real. In the darkness, he saw himself as a child, helpless, wandering through an endless void where faces of the dead floated in silence, their eyes hollow and accusing. Each face he saw seemed familiar, neighbors, friends, even strangers who had gone missing over the years, faces he'd seen on flyers and in the news, all twisted in expressions of fear and anguish. And then there was his sister. Her face hovered just out of reach, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth moving silently, as if she were trying to tell him something important. The words refused to reach him, trapped in the oppressive silence, leaving only the haunting image of her pleading face. Lucas's heart raced as his mind began to spiral, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, a frantic rhythm that only seemed to amplify the sense of dread that wrapped around him. Every beat seemed to sync with a new vision, of himself slipping into the well, hands grasping at him from the darkness, voices screaming his name. He felt his sanity fraying, his thoughts unraveling, as the fear rooted itself deep within him, coiling around his mind like serpent, squeezing tighter and tighter. The well seemed to breathe, each exhale filling the air with an icy fog that clouded his vision and dulled his senses. A whisper, sharper and clearer than the others, cut through the cacophony. "The fear will set you free." The words echoed in his mind, seductive and tempting, as if offering him an escape from the nightmares closing in. A twisted logic took hold of him. Maybe, if he surrendered to the fear, if he let it consume him, he could understand what the well wanted from him. Perhaps he could face whatever lay hidden within it and finally uncover the truth, even if it meant losing himself in the process. Driven by desperation, Lucas allowed the fear to seep deeper, letting it take control. The terror intensified, distorting his senses, twisting the world around him into something alien and grotesque. The trees loomed larger, their branches contorting into skeletal arms that seemed to reach for him, grasping, their twisted fingers brushing against his skin. Shadows slithered closer, forming grotesque shapes that mocked him, whispering his darkest secrets, his hidden regrets, every mistake he buried over the years. The darkness was alive, sentient, knowing his every weakness, every insecurity, and it was using them to pull him deeper into its grasp. Suddenly, his vision blurred, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though he were standing on the edge of a great chasm. He could see himself, reflected in the murky depths of the well, but the reflection was distorted, twisted into something monstrous, its face contorted in an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The reflection began to smile, a wicked, knowing grin that sent a wave of nausea through him. It whispered back at him, its voice a cruel mockery of his own. "You can't escape me, Lucas. I am you, the part you've hidden all your life. And now you're mine." The words sliced through his mind, planting a seed of horror that blossomed within him, rooting him to the spot. He tried to look away, but his own reflection held him captive, its eyes boring into his, seeing straight into his soul. He could feel the fear morphing into something darker, something consuming, and he realized with dawning horror that he was losing control, becoming one with the darkness that surrounded him. The well wasn't just calling him, it was absorbing him, pulling his very essence into its depths. In a final act of defiance, Lucas closed his eyes, clutching at the fading memories of his sister, of moments that reminded him of who he truly was. But the fear was too powerful, washing over him like a wave, drowning his thoughts, erasing his identity. The shadows wrapped around him, a cold embrace that felt both comforting and deadly, a lullaby of despair that lulled him into surrender. For the briefest moment, he felt an overwhelming peace, a calmness that came from surrendering to the inevitable. Then, just as he was about to slip into the depths of the well's darkness, a distant voice pierced through the fog, a voice full of warmth of love. "Lucas," it called, softer, more real than any whisper from the well. It was his sister's voice, not as a ghostly echo, but as he remembered it from his childhood, full of life and hope. The sound shattered the hold of the darkness, breaking through the fear, pulling him back from the edge. Lucas opened his eyes, gasping, his heartbeat thundering in his ears as he fought to hold onto the last remnants of his sanity. The well pulsed angrily, as if enraged by his defiance, the shadows around him retreating slightly, their whispers fading into sullen murmurs. He staggered backward, his mind reeling, but for the first time, he felt a spark of resistance, a flicker of strength that pushed back against the darkness. His sister's voice lingered in his mind, anchoring him, reminding him of who he was, of the life he'd left behind, a life he wasn't willing to surrender to the shadows. But even as he stepped away from the well, he knew that the temptation of fear would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. The well had shown him the darkness within himself, and he knew he would carry that with him forever. Lucas steadied himself, his pulse racing as he felt the echo of his sister's voice fade, leaving him alone once more with the ominous presence of the well. His heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination, the memories of his sister anchoring him just enough to resist the call of the darkness. Yet he couldn't escape the pull. He knew that this moment, this encounter, was inevitable. Whatever haunted this well, whatever twisted force lay hidden in its depths, had waited for him, had called to him. Now, he had to confront it, face the shadow that had lingered over his life like a curse. Taking a deep breath, Lucas leaned over the edge of the well, the light from his flashlight barely penetrating the suffocating darkness. It was as though the well itself consumed the light, drinking it in hungrily, leaving only an impenetrable void. He could feel something watching him from below, a malignant awareness that seemed to stretch up from the depths, reaching out with invisible tendrils of darkness that coiled around his mind. His own reflection shimmered faintly in the shadows, twisted and distorted, as though a darker version of himself stared back with hollow, accusing eyes. And then, from the darkness, a figure began to take shape. It started as a vague shadow, a mass of darkness coalescing into form, solidifying as it rose closer to the surface. Lucas's heart stuttered as he recognized the shape. It was his sister, but her face was not the one he remembered from childhood. Her features were pale and sunken, her eyes dark and empty, like twin abysses that seemed to pull him in. She looked up at him, her expression blank, yet filled with an unsettling, quiet rage. She was both familiar and terrifyingly alien, a specter twisted by the well's darkness. Lucas. Her voice drifted up, faint and hollow, tinged with a bitterness he didn't recognize. It was as though the years of being trapped in the well had drained her of warmth, leaving only a shadow of the person she once was. "Why did you leave me?" Her words hit him like a blow, filling him with a crushing guilt that he'd tried to bury. The well had twisted her voice, her very essence, making her the embodiment of his darkest regrets, his deepest fears. "I didn't know. I didn't understand," he stammered, feeling the weight of his own failures pressing down on him. The figure reached up, her hand extending toward him, and for a moment, he thought he saw the glimmer of the sister he'd lost, the innocence and love that had once filled her. But as her fingers brushed the surface of the well, her form flickered, her face contorting into something monstrous, her mouth twisting into a silent scream. The darkness seemed to pulse, absorbing her pain, amplifying it until it became a weapon, a blade of despair aimed straight at him. Lucas felt his mind shatter, fragments of memories and emotions twisting together, pulling him into a vortex of grief and horror. He could see her last moments, replaying in his mind as if they were his own. The feeling of cold, suffocating darkness surrounding her, the endless descent into isolation, and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would come to save her. But no one had. She had been alone, abandoned to the shadows, and the well had fed on her despair, transforming her into this vengeful specter that stood before him. In a moment of clarity, Lucas realized that the well was not just a prison. It was a parasite, feeding off the souls it trapped, twisting them into manifestations of torment and rage. His sister had been consumed by its darkness, her spirit corrupted and bound to the well's endless hunger. And now it wanted him, wanted to add him to its collection, to twist his soul as it had twisted hers, feeding on his guilt, his fear, until there was nothing left of who he was. But there was one chance, a faint glimmer of hope that flickered in the depths of his mind. He could save her, perhaps even free her from the well's grip, but it would require a sacrifice, a part of himself he could never reclaim. He would have to give up his most cherished memory of her, the one thing that had kept him going all these years. He would have to let go of the image of her as his innocent, loving sister, release the memories of their shared laughter, their childhood joy. If he offered that to the well, if he surrendered that piece of himself, perhaps it would release her soul. The choice tore at him, leaving him paralyzed, his heart breaking at the thought. But as he looked into her hollow, tortured eyes, he knew he couldn't leave her like this, couldn't abandon her to the darkness that had stolen her life. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let go, releasing the memory, feeling it slip away like sand through his fingers. The image of his sister's smile faded, her laughter became a distant echo, until all that was left was the ghostly figure before him. As he opened his eyes, he saw her change. The darkness began to recede from her face, her features softening, her eyes filling with a faint light, a spark of the person she once was. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, and her expression softened, a trace of sadness mingling with gratitude. She reached out, her hand touching his cheek, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he felt her warmth, felt the bond they once shared. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a peace that transcended the horror surrounding them. And then, like a breath of wind, she was gone, her form dissolving into the darkness, leaving only silence in her wake. The well fell quiet, its hunger momentarily sated, and Lucas felt the weight of his sacrifice settle over him. He had saved her, but at a terrible cost. The memory of her was gone, lost to the shadows, and though he knew he had done the right thing, a part of him felt hollow, incomplete. He looked down into the well one last time, feeling its dark presence retreat, its whispers fading into silence. Yet, even as he stepped away, he could sense it watching him, waiting, as if it knew he would carry this night with him forever. The stillness that followed Lucas's sacrifice was eerie, a heavy silence that enveloped him like a shroud. As he stepped back from the well, he felt an unsettling void where the connection to his sister had once been. The air was charged with a sinister energy, thick and palpable, as if the darkness itself was watching him, waiting for the moment to strike. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the well pulsating with fury, its depths writhing in response to his defiance. But instead, it stood ominously quiet, its surface reflecting the pale moonlight, appearing deceptively calm. But Lucas knew better. He could feel the malevolence swirling around him, the air growing heavier, and a creeping dread settled in his gut. The well was not finished with him yet. As he took another step backward, the ground beneath him trembled, a low rumble that vibrated through his bones. The shadows around him began to shift, coiling and twisting, and suddenly, a voice echoed from the depths of the well, low and resonant, laced with an ancient malice. "You think you can escape? You think you can defy me?" His heart raced as he recognized the voice. It was not just the echoes of his sister, it was the well itself, the dark entity that had fed off the souls it had trapped for generations. The shadows surged around him, engulfing him in a cold embrace, dragging him closer to the well as if they were tendrils of a monstrous creature, eager to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. "You belong to me now, Lucas. Your fear, your guilt, they are mine to consume." "No," he shouted, the word tearing from his throat as he fought against the pull of the darkness. The more he resisted, the stronger the shadows became, wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the well's gaping maw. He could feel their icy grasp digging into his flesh, leaving behind a trail of freezing terror. Panic surged through him, but amid the fear, a spark of defiance ignited deep within. With every ounce of strength, Lucas fought against the shadowy embrace. He remembered the faces of those who had suffered at the hands of the well, the countless souls that had been lost to its hunger. He remembered the laughter of his sister, the warmth of their shared memories. Those were the weapons he could wield against this darkness. Summoning his courage, he shouted, "You will not take me. I refuse to be another victim." As if responding to his words, the shadows recoiled, momentarily retreating in the face of his defiance. He seized the opportunity, his instincts screaming at him to escape. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him bucked violently, throwing him off balance. He stumbled, barely catching himself, but he could hear the whispers rising again, growing louder, more frantic. They filled his mind with images of despair, faces contorted in anguish, pleading for release, demanding vengeance. Suddenly, from the depths of the well, a horrific figure emerged. It was a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and despair, a twisted representation of the darkness that had consumed so many. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, fierce and hungry, boring into Lucas's soul. It opened its mouth, and a cacophony of tortured screams erupted, filling the air with a deafening roar that threatened to drown him in its rage. "Your defiance is futile," the entity hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers entwined in one. "You are connected to this place, bound by blood and memory. You cannot escape your fate." As it spoke, the shadows seemed to stretch out toward him, eager to grasp him in their clutches, ready to drag him into the abyss. With each word, Lucas felt his resolve wavering. The darkness was powerful, seductive, preying on his fears and doubts. But he refused to let it take him. Drawing on the strength of his memories, he shouted back, "You will not win. I choose to remember the light, the love. You have no power over me." In that moment of defiance, a surge of energy pulsed through him, igniting the air with a brilliant light that pierced through the shadows. The entity recoiled, shrieking in rage as the light pushed back the darkness, illuminating the well's depths and revealing the tortured faces of those it had trapped. They were crying out, their voices rising in a chorus of hope and despair, mingling with Lucas's own as they sought to break free. The well trembled violently, and the shadows writhed, twisting and turning as if in agony. The darkness was fighting back, desperate to maintain its hold, but the light burned brighter, fueled by Lucas's determination. He could feel the connection to the lost souls growing stronger, their collective anguish merging with his own strength. With every ounce of will, he forced himself forward, refusing to be pulled back into the abyss. The entity roared, its form shifting, twisting in pain as the light enveloped it, peeling back the layers of darkness that had consumed it for so long. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal," it screamed, but Lucas pressed on, channeling the memories of those who had suffered, of his sister, of the joy and love that had once filled their lives. With one final push, Lucas shouted, "You are nothing. You are a monster born of fear and despair." The words resonated, shaking the very ground beneath him. The light surged forth, blindingly bright, and with a final, ear-splitting scream, the entity was consumed, swallowed by the brilliance that shattered the darkness once and for all. The well erupted in a shockwave of light, the shadows dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Lucas stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the power of the well surged upward, breaking the bonds that had held it captive for centuries. The anguished cries of lost souls began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light, free at last from their torment. As the last remnants of darkness vanished, Lucas felt a wave of relief wash over him. The weight of despair lifted, leaving only silence in its wake. He stood at the edge of the well, breathless, staring into its depths now filled with light. The entity was gone, and with it, the curse that had haunted him for so long. But as he turned to leave, he knew that the battle was not truly over. The memories of the well, of the darkness he had faced, would linger with him forever. He had confronted the terror that had consumed so many, but the scars it left behind would be a reminder of the darkness that existed not just in the world, but within himself. And as he walked away, he glanced back one last time, a whisper of doubt creeping into his mind. Though the well was silent now, a faint echo lingered in the air, a reminder that darkness can always return, lurking just beyond the edge of light, waiting for a moment of weakness to reclaim its hold. Lucas took a few tentative steps away from the well, the chill of the night air wrapping around him like a funeral shroud. The silence that followed the eruption of light felt surreal, almost oppressive, as if the world itself held its breath in the aftermath of his confrontation with the darkness. The well, now devoid of its sinister presence, stood like a hollow monument to the horrors it had contained, a dark history etched into the stones that still bore the scars of despair. But as he walked away, the weight of what he had experienced clung to him like a shadow, refusing to fade with the light. Though he had vanquished the entity that had haunted the well, a sense of unease gnawed at him, whispering insidiously that the battle was far from over. The echoes of tortured souls lingered in his mind, their cries etched in his memory, reminding him of the pain and suffering that had unfolded within those depths. He felt their eyes upon him, their collective sorrow a burden he could not shake. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he paused, turning back to look one last time at the well. The moon hung high above, casting an ethereal glow that illuminated the stones, yet somehow it only deepened the shadows around the structure, making it appear even more foreboding. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure flicker at the edge of his vision, a shadow flitting just out of reach, but when he focused, there was nothing there. His heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out along his spine. The darkness might have been banished, but it had left behind a residue, a lingering sense of foreboding that something was still watching him. With a shudder, Lucas turned and began walking back through the dense woods, the path illuminated only by the faint glow of his flashlight. The silence was palpable, interrupted only by the crunch of leaves underfoot, yet it felt heavy, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. He quickened his pace, anxiety tightening in his chest. Every rustle in the underbrush sent adrenaline surging through his veins, his mind replaying the horrors he had just escaped. Had the well truly released its grip, or had it merely retreated, waiting for him to let his guard down? As he reached the outskirts of the forest, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, warping and twisting in the moonlight, as if the very trees were alive with whispers. Doubt crept in, gnawing at his resolve. What if the well was not entirely empty? What if the darkness had merely changed form, becoming something more insidious, more difficult to detect? The thought chilled him to the bone, and he hurried forward, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the woods. The road home felt longer than he remembered, the oppressive silence amplifying the sense of dread that clung to him. When he finally reached his car, Lucas fumbled for the keys in his trembling hands, glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see shadows pooling behind him. But there was only darkness, an empty stretch of road leading back to the safety of the town. He climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind him, as if that simple act could shield him from the lingering horrors of the night. As he drove, the familiar landscape blurred past him, but his thoughts were consumed by the remnants of the well and the faces of the lost souls that had called to him. They were free now, but at what cost? He had lost a part of himself in that confrontation, and no matter how much he tried to shake it off, the sense of loss loomed like a dark cloud, threatening to engulf him once more. Upon reaching home, he flicked on the lights and stepped inside, the warmth of the familiar space a stark contrast to the cold terror of the well. But even as he shut the door behind him, a creeping sensation washed over him, a feeling that something was amiss. The air felt charged, thick with anticipation, and he paused in the hallway, listening for any sounds that might betray the presence of an intruder. There was nothing, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of a clock, yet the silence seemed deafening. Lucas moved through the house, checking every room, each step echoing unnervingly in the stillness. He made his way to his sister's old room, where the air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. The door creaked as he opened it, and he hesitated on the threshold. Dust motes floated in the slanting light, settling over a room untouched by time, yet it felt as though the past lingered there, waiting for him to remember. He approached the small bookshelf, running his fingers over the spines of the books, each one a reminder of the laughter they once shared. Then, his gaze fell on a photograph resting on the desk, a picture of him and his sister, smiles bright, innocence captured in a moment that felt so distant now. But when he looked closer, something sent a chill down his spine. In the background of the photo, just at the edge of the frame, was a shadow, a dark shape that seemed to twist and writhe, barely visible but unmistakably present. His breath caught in his throat, and the air around him thickened, stifling. He turned away, heart racing, and rushed out of the room. The well's darkness hadn't been exorcised from his life. It had simply changed its form, lurking in the corners of his home, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The memory of his sister, once a source of comfort, now felt tainted, a reminder of the connection that the well had severed and yet still sought to reclaim. The walls seemed to close in on him as he stumbled into the living room, his mind racing with dread. Had he truly defeated the darkness, or had it merely retreated, laying in wait for his vulnerability? The thought of it lurking just beyond the veil of normalcy was paralyzing. Lucas realized with a sinking feeling that the well had opened a door within him, a connection to a world of shadows and whispers that would never truly close. He sat on the couch, the silence of the house pressing down upon him like a weight, and the shadows around him felt alive, filled with secrets and dread. The faces of the lost souls drifted through his mind, their cries echoing in the depths of his consciousness. He couldn't escape the feeling that they were still watching, still waiting for him to acknowledge the darkness that had taken so much from him. As the hours slipped by and the night deepened, Lucas could feel the dread creeping back in, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He knew he would never forget the well or the choice he had made. The terror had woven itself into the fabric of his being, a haunting reminder that some mysteries never truly fade, and some shadows never fully dissipate. The well was no longer just a place. It had become a part of him, a dark legacy that he would carry forever, a reminder that the darkness could return, lurking just beyond the edge of light, waiting for him to falter.